14 of the wealthiest plantation owners in South Carolina convened at the Grayfield estate during the hot summer of 1716 for what they thought would be a standard business meeting. Not one of them survived. 3 days later, officials found burned bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a large coal furnace, which baffled understanding. Their mouths were filled with raw cotton, and their hands were shackled by iron. Esperanza de Lima, a slave woman, was the sole witness. She was discovered sitting quietly in the kitchen of the estate, painstakingly sharpening kitchen knives while singing a Portuguese ballad. The only thing she said in terrible English when asked was, "Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete." Governor Robert Johnson ordered the colonial records of this occurrence to be sealed, and they were buried in Charleston's archives for more than 200 years. Tonight, we unveil the horrifying reality of what came to be known as the Grayfield Massacre, a tale of retaliation so systematic and vicious that it altered the colony's perception of its human property as a whole. I need you to do something for me before we go on to the tale of Esperanza de Lima and the night that rocked colonial South Carolina to its foundation. Stories like this one, which have been suppressed by time and people in positions of authority, ought to be heard. Therefore, click the subscribe button and sound the alert. Tell me in the comments what state you're listening from while you're at it. Does your own backyard harbor any sinister historical secrets? Let's travel back in time to 1716 and see how one of the most well-planned acts of retaliation in colonial American history was planned by a woman who was viewed as nothing more than property. The story starts in the busy port city of Charleston, South Carolina, 15 years prior to that terrible night. Building on the backs of Africans held in slavery who labored on the rice plantations that dotted the coastal lowlands, the colony was enjoying unheard-of prosperity in 1701. Edmund Grayfield, a second-generation colonist whose family had built out a 3,000-acre empire from the swamplands north of the Ashley River, was one of the most prosperous planters. Even by the harsh standards of his era, Grayfield was a particularly vicious guy. He was moreover 6 feet tall and had a reputation for emotionally and physically destroying slaves. His pale blue eyes seemed to look through people instead of at them. In the slave quarters in the area, rumors circulated about his property, Grayfield Estate. Slaves who were transported there were reported to either perish within a year or return as empty shells of the people they were before. A Portuguese slave ship named the Santa Maria brought 180 slaves from the Angolan coast to Charleston Harbor in September of 1701. One of them, a young woman of maybe 20, would be renamed Esperanza de Lima by her new master. The white colonists examined her like livestock at the market, but they did not instantly see what set her apart from the other slaves. Her bright black eyes and elaborate tribal scarification on her shoulders, which recounted the narrative of her royal lineage, a secret her captors would never know, described her average height and physique. They were unaware that Esperanza was the daughter of a strong village chief and had been taught from an early age the skills of negotiation, strategy, and what colonial minds would have written off as witchcraft, but which was actually a deep knowledge of human psychology, poisons, and medicines. She had seen her father killed, her village burned, and her people enslaved by Portuguese raiders. Every white face she saw was associated with that original sin in her mind. She was acquired by Edmund Grayfield for 42 pounds sterling, a significant amount that was commensurate with her youth and apparent health. His ambitions for his new acquisition were clear. Everyone on the estate knew that Sarah, Grayfield's former house slave, had been beaten to death for spilling wine on his beautiful English carpet, but she had just passed away under unexplained circumstances. Esperanza started what would turn into a 15-year campaign of close observation and painstaking preparation on her first day at Grayfield Estate. Although she pretended to comprehend much less than she actually did, she picked up English quickly. She observed. She paid attention. She recalled every insult, every act of brutality, and every name that was brought up in whispered discussions among the plantation elite. In addition to being a place of residence, the Grayfield Estate served as the informal gathering spot for the 14 plantation owners known to the planters as the Rice Council, who dominated the colony's agricultural policies and, consequently, its political destiny. These men met once a month to talk about slave laws, rice prices, and how to make as much money as possible while avoiding London's colonial inspection. They considered themselves independent of all earthly authorities, ruling their own territories. The 14 members of this council represented the most powerful families in the colony. Edmund Grayfield, the unofficial leader. William Piton, whose plantation produced more rice than any other in the Americas. James Rutherford, who also served as a colonial judge. Marcus Sutton, who owned the largest slave trading operation between Charleston and Savannah. Henry Caldwell, whose political connections reached all the way to the governor's office. Thomas Harrington, a former British naval officer who ruled his plantation like a military compound. Benjamin Fairfax, whose family fortune dated back to the earliest colonial settlements. Samuel Kingsley, who specialized in seasoning newly arrived African slaves. Robert Fielding, known for his innovative torture techniques. Charles Warwick, whose plantation bordered 3 others and served as a nexus for information. Jonathan Crichton, who maintained detailed records of slave breeding programs. David Norris, whose medical background made him particularly effective at keeping slaves alive just long enough to extract maximum labor. Alexander Hartwell, whose plantation served as a prison for runaway slaves from across the region. And finally, George Baxter, the youngest member at 35, whose enthusiasm for violence had earned him rapid acceptance into this exclusive circle. These men weren't just mean. They were consistently wicked, viewing people as merely farm tools to be used, fixed, and then thrown away as the market demanded. During their monthly meetings, they boasted about their most inventive punishments, compared notes on the best calorie intake to maximize productivity while reducing expenses, and discussed strategies for calming down disobedient individuals. For 15 years, Esperanza attended these gatherings, creeping silently like a shadow around the dining room, emptying dishes and refilling drinks as these men talked about their human property like cattle. She listened as they discussed the differences between branding and whipping, laughed about families they had split up, and planned operational expansions that would necessitate bringing in hundreds more slaves. However, it was something far more particular and intimate than the general brutality of slavery that really sparked Esperanza's scheme. For Esperanza de Lima, everything changed in the spring of 1715. She had done what the plantation owners thought was impossible after 14 years of silent servitude. She had remained human while residing in hell. Above all, she had discovered love. He was born on the Rutherford estate in 1693, making him 22 years old when he attracted Esperanza's attention. His name was Kwame, but the plantation records simply referred to him as Boy Tom. The harsh seasoning process that broke most slaves within their first year had somehow managed to preserve Kwame's unique blend of physical prowess, intellectual curiosity. He had secretly learned to read from a kind overseer who had since passed away. During the short Sunday rest times, he had also been surreptitiously teaching other slaves the fundamentals of letters and numbers. Kwame and Esperanza first met in private to exchange information about their owner's whereabouts and ambitions. Slowly and deliberately, with the patience of those who knew that discovery would bring death, their bond grew closer. They conveyed information about escape routes, friendly contacts, and resistance opportunities using a system of songs and gestures that, to white spectators, seemed to be little more than normal slave conduct. They created what was arguably colonial South Carolina's most advanced intelligence network by the end of 1715. While Kwame used his job assignments, he was regularly loaned out to other farms for heavy labor to build relationships throughout the area. Esperanza used her position at the Rice Council meetings to learn about plantation vulnerabilities, patrol schedules, and legislative developments. They were preparing an unusual event, a planned rebellion that might free hundreds of slaves from several plantations, rather than a straightforward escape attempt that would only impact themselves. They had located benevolent white people, laid out safe havens, and even made contact with free black communities in Spanish Florida that would be able to accommodate runaway slaves. However, basic human emotion undid all of their meticulous planning. At the monthly meeting of the Rice Council on the 15th of March 1716, Edmund Grayfield declared his intention to increase the scope of his breeding effort. Among his female slaves, he had found a number of prime specimens who would be mated with males from other plantations to create what he referred to as superior working stock. The program would start right away, with the chosen females being transferred to a different compound where they would be closely watched to guarantee successful pregnancies. First on his list was Esperanza's name. She was serving wine to the council members when she overheard this talk, and although her expression was neutral, something inside of her changed. She had persevered through 15 years of slavery by holding on to her hopes for liberation, retribution, and a day when she would no longer be treated as property but as a human being. At this point, Grayfield intended to turn her into a breeding animal. She met Kwame that evening at their usual location, a fallen cypress tree tucked away in the rice fields of the estate, where the clamor of insects and nightbirds would drown out their conversations. They both understood what Grayfield's idea meant when she informed him about it. It would be hard for them to communicate after she was transferred to the breeding compound. They would lose their intelligence system. They would perish before their planned rebellion could start. Desperate, Kwame proposed that they run that night. Within a week, a Spanish trader he had contacted might transport them to Street Augustine. From a position of relative safety, they might be able to help other slaves, start a new life, and be free. Esperanza, however, declined. "Running saves us," she informed him in their mother tongue, Portuguese, which they reserved for their most intimate discussions. She had spent 15 years witnessing these 14 men casually and cruelly make judgments that impacted thousands of lives. But it changes nothing for our people. These men will continue their evil. More ships will arrive. More families will be destroyed. More children will grow up as property. She had heard them joke about being separated, talk about torture methods like cooking recipes, and plot to grow their operations so that individuals who looked like her would suffer even more. "I have learned their patterns," she added. "I know their secrets. I know when they are most vulnerable. We have one chance to send a message that will be remembered forever. One chance to make them afraid the way they make us afraid." Kwame realized what she was implying, and he felt frightened. Not feared death, slaves were always in danger of dying, but of the methodical torture that would come before their execution if they were discovered. He had witnessed the fate of slaves who raised their hands in opposition to white people. The purpose of the penalties was to set an example and depress all other slaves who saw them. However, he also realized Esperanza was correct. 2 lives would be saved, and the system would remain intact thanks to their planned escape. Her other option was unimaginably risky. However, it presented the prospect of something more significant, a challenge to slavery that could motivate others, or at the very least, cause slave owners to reconsider their blatant brutality. The following 2 weeks were devoted to honing a strategy that included elements of a military strike, psychological warfare, and intelligence operation. Esperanza would set up a chance for deadly vengeance by using her access to the monthly Rice Council meeting. Kwame would take care of the logistics, including obtaining supplies, setting up alibis for benevolent slaves, and developing backup plans for different eventualities. They created what may have been the most sophisticated act of slave resistance in colonial American history, and it was all based on a straightforward observation made by Esperanza during her 15 years of service. The members of the Rice Council were so sure of their absolute power that they had lost concern for their own safety. Their final meeting would be the monthly gathering on the 23rd of June, 1716. The sweltering heat of the 23rd of June, 1716, made the summers in South Carolina almost intolerable for everyone but those who had grown up in equatorial Africa. As she had done every day for the past 15 years, Esperanza got up before the sun rose and started her morning ritual. Today, however, was different. 15 years of intense observation, careful preparation, and repressed anger culminated in this day. In order to allow the 14 plantation owners time to go to Grayfield Estate and take care of any last-minute business before the official session, the monthly Rice Council meeting was set to start at 2:00 the afternoon. Depending on the agenda and how much imported rum Edmund Grayfield gave his guests, these sessions usually lasted 4 to 6 hours. Esperanza had devoted weeks to researching past meeting trends, taking note of everything from agenda item timing to restroom breaks to seating arrangements. She was aware that Marcus Sutton was always the first to arrive for private meetings with Grayfield. She was aware that Benjamin Fairfax would excuse himself around every 90 minutes due to a weak bladder. She was aware that the price of rice was always discussed before supper was served, and that the management of slaves was usually discussed after the rum had relaxed their tongues. Above all, she was aware of the coal furnace. The enormous kitchen at Grayfield Estate, which was constructed in 1695, was intended to provide food for the main house, as well as the numerous overseers, artisans, and domestic slaves that resided there. This kitchen's focal point was a massive coal-burning furnace that had been expensively brought from Britain. This furnace was perfect for large-scale cooking operations because it could sustain exceptionally high temperatures for lengthy periods of time. Unlike the wood-burning fireplaces used in the majority of colonial dwellings, built of imported fire brick and encircled by iron devices for hanging pots, holding spits, and controlling airflow, the furnace was nearly 8 feet tall and 4 feet square. It could reach temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper and silver when completely fueled by coal. Grayfield was so proud of this furnace that he frequently displayed it to guests as proof of his wealth and refinement. Grayfield was unaware that Esperanza had spent months surreptitiously researching the furnace's functioning, learning how to regulate its temperature, sustain its maximum heat for prolonged periods of time, and manage its airflow to produce particular conditions. She also informed the overseers that Mr. Grayfield had ordered more fuel for a projected increase of cooking activities, and she had been accumulating coal in a storage room next to the kitchen. Esperanza's resolve was unquestionably strengthened by the sad news she heard 3 days prior to the meeting. They had sold Kwame. James Rutherford had persuaded Grayfield to sell him Boy Tom for £60 sterling after deciding that his plantation needed more field workers for an expansion project. Kwame would be moved to the Rutherford plantation the next morning, and the deal would be finalized just after the Rice Council meeting. Esperanza realized that her window of chance was closing forever when she heard about this transaction. She would lose the man she loved in 3 days, be compelled to participate in a breeding scheme that would break her spirit, and watch helplessly while the Rice Council persisted in its systemic abuse of her people. There was no more time for patience. She met Kwame that night for what they both knew would be their final encounter. They shared 15 years of memories condensed into a few priceless hours as they conversed in whispers next to the downed cypress tree. That very night, Kwame pleaded with her one last time to change her mind and flee with him. Time remained to construct a life together free from the cruelty of plantation slavery and to flee to Spanish Florida. Esperanza, however, had already decided. She informed him, "These men think they are gods. They believe they can do anything to us without consequence. Tomorrow, I will show them they are wrong. I will show them that we are human beings, not animals, and that human beings fight back when pushed beyond endurance." Kwame realized there was no use in disputing. Less than 2 years had passed since he first met Esperanza, but he had already learned to hear the steel in her voice when she was fully committed. Rather, he used their remaining time together to assist her in honing the last aspects of her strategy. Esperanza started making her last preparations early the following morning, June 22. She began by thoroughly inspecting the kitchen and the storage spaces that were adjacent, noting any equipment, supplies, or ingredients that would be needed. She focused especially on the iron chains and shackles kept in the pantry of the kitchen, which were usually used to confine slaves during punishment, but were always on hand on the plantation. She also kept a close eye on the arrangement of the kitchen and the daily movements of other domestic slaves. Her plan's success would rest in part on preventing innocent slaves from witnessing the events that transpired, and in part on keeping things looking normal until the crucial moment came. Above all, she started to get the coal furnace ready. In order to gradually raise the internal temperature while keeping the appearance of normal culinary preparations, she started pouring coal into the furnace at precisely timed intervals at dawn. The furnace was ready to sustain maximum heat for several hours by late morning when it was getting close to its top operational temperature. Nothing about Esperanza's behavior stood out to the other domestic slaves. She had always worked quietly and methodically, and her preparations for the monthly meeting of the Rice Council seemed to be the same as those she had done for earlier meetings. She set up the imported crystal glasses that Grayfield used to dazzle his guests, cleaned the dining area, and arranged the furnishings and serving utensils. In the kitchen, however, plans were being hatched to turn a mundane business meeting into something much darker. The first members of the Rice Council started to arrive at Grayfield Estate at midday on the 23rd of June 1716. Marcus Sutton was early as usual, riding along the oak-lined path leading to the main house with the assurance of a man who controlled more than 800 people and thought he was above all earthly authorities. From the kitchen window, Esperanza observed Sutton dismounting his horse and giving the reins to a slave from the stable. Sutton, one of the more senior members of the Rice Council, was 53 years old, and his body was a testament to decades of luxurious living. He had the red-faced complexion of a man who drank more imported rum than was technically healthy, thinning gray hair, and a heavy build. He had made his money by seeing people as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited as efficiently as possible, but his eyes remained calculating and sharp. The cruel practice of breaking up recently arrived African slaves and persuading them to accept their situation as inevitable and permanent was known as seasoning and was the specialty of Sutton's plantation. Particularly resistant slaves were frequently sold to Sutton, who had come up with ever more inventive ways to break their will to resist. Other plantation owners frequently referred their problem slaves to his organization, paying top dollar for his services because his methods had become so honed. At the front entrance, Edmund Grayfield received Sutton with the ornate decorum that slave owners save for one another, while treating their slaves as if they were animals. To discuss commercial issues too delicate for the wider group, the two men withdrew to Grayfield's private study. They mainly discussed new methods for controlling slaves and ways to persuade the colonial administration to loosen limitations on the importation of slaves. The remaining 12 members of the Rice Council came in small groups throughout the course of the following hour, causing traffic to jam around the main house's circular drive due to the presence of their carriages and horses. Having attended enough meetings to be familiar with each man's face, voice, and specific areas of skill in the administration of human property, Esperanza was able to identify each one as he arrived. Following the near suppression of a recent slave insurrection attempt on his estate, William Peton arrived with his customary retinue of armed overseers. Although James Rutherford arrived by himself, his horse was equipped with the characteristic silver-mounted pistols that promoted his dual position as colonial magistrate and plantation owner. In an attempt to emphasize his social aspirations and political connections, Henry Caldwell drove in a lavishly painted carriage that bore his family's coat of arms. The same ceremonial formality, the same niceties about the weather, the crops, and the persistent Indian problem along the boundary were extended to each new visitor. As pioneers converting a wilderness into fertile agricultural land to feed the expanding cities of colonial America, these men considered themselves the forerunners of a great civilization. Their wealth was derived from the unpaid labor of thousands of people who were treated like livestock. Their civilization was founded on a foundation of systematic brutality, and their political power was largely used to maintain and grow this system of exploitation. These were the things they refused to acknowledge. Edmund Grayfield convened the monthly meeting in his formal dining room at exactly 2, around a huge oak table that had been brought in from England at a price that would have sustained a normal colonial family for years. The 14 men took their usual seats. They felt more entitled and superior because of the opulent and sophisticated ambiance created by the glossy surface of the table, reflecting the light from the several candles set in silver candelabras. As these guys talked about the business of slavery with the casual savagery that had marked their previous 180 monthly sessions, Esperanza started serving the dinner with her normal efficiency and moved silently around the table. These were conversations she had heard hundreds of times. However, she paid close attention to every word, tone, and casual allusion to human misery today. As usual, the first item on the agenda was the Charleston market's rice prices and ways to increase profits for the upcoming harvest season. by introducing what he called incentive-based management, a system that gave slaves who exceeded daily quotas minor food prizes while punishing underachievers systematically. William Piton claimed that his plantation had reached record productivity levels. James Rutherford nodded in agreement. "The key," Piton stated as he cut his imported steak, "is making them understand that their comfort level depends entirely on their productivity. Give them just enough hope to keep working, but never enough security to make them complacent. I've had excellent results with family separation as a motivational tool." Nothing makes a field hand work harder than knowing that his wife and children are being held at a different location and that reunion depends on consistent performance. Each participant shared strategies for maximizing labor from their human property while limiting costs for food, housing, and medical care, and the discussion went on in this manner for about an hour. They planned animal enhancements with the same clinical detachment that cattle ranchers used when discussing breeding schemes. They contrasted notes on methods of punishment with the eagerness of artisans exchanging trade secrets. As these men reveled in their most recent advances in human depravity, Esperanza cleaned plates and replenished wine glasses. In her thoughts, she was taking last-minute notes about each man's position, his habits, and his potential for resistance when the time came, but she kept her customary appearance of blank subservience. The men started telling anecdotes that exposed the full extent of their cruelty when the official agenda came to an end and the discussion shifted to a more casual format. Marcus Sutton explained a brand new torture apparatus he had brought in from the Caribbean, a metal cage that was just big enough to hold a human body suspended in direct sunlight and capable of practically cooking disobedient captives to death over several days. Samuel Kingsley boasted of his most recent breeding experiment, in which he forced a few chosen slaves to mate in the hopes of creating a new generation of larger, more powerful field hands. However, the ultimate impetus for what was going to happen came from George Baxter, the youngest council member. "Gentlemen," Baxter said while Esperanza was pouring brandy for beverages, "I have exciting news about a new business opportunity. The Spanish are paying premium prices for experienced slaves in their South American territories. I'm proposing that we pool our resources to purchase a large ship and begin systematic exportation of our older, less productive stock." As the 14 men started estimating the possible earnings from selling their human property to Spanish colonies where working conditions were much more harsh than those in South Carolina, the room erupted in animated conversation. They evaluated how many slaves they could export while keeping enough workers for their plantations, reviewed logistics, and talked about political contacts who could help them obtain the required permissions. Esperanza felt something inside her shatter as she listened to these men plot the ruin of yet more lives. She had kept herself sane for 15 years by convincing herself that their brutality had its bounds, that ultimately, even these malevolent men will acknowledge the limits of human decency. However, there were no restrictions. Boundaries did not exist. Only their own imagination and economic considerations limited their ability to inflict agony. It was time to demonstrate to them what helplessness felt like. Esperanza de Lima took action at precisely 9:47 p.m., as indicated by the imported German clock that was displayed in Grayfield's dining room. The Rice Council's 14 members had wrapped up their official work and gotten into the relaxed after-dinner chat that usually marked the end of their monthly sessions. The scent of foreign tobacco and pricey brandy filled the room, which was warm from body heat and candlelight. The majority of the men had relaxed their formal dress and assumed the easy stance of those who felt totally comfortable in their position of power. In order to create what they saw as a higher class of slaves, specifically bred for intelligence, strength, and docility, Samuel Kingsley proposed to set up a comprehensive breeding registry that would trace bloodlines throughout all of their farms. They were debating genetic principles with the same disinterestedness they might show when discussing crop rotation or soil development, and the talk had become technical, almost scholarly. Esperanza excused herself from the dining table, apparently to get more brandy from the kitchen, but none of them noticed. She secured all the doors of the main house except the kitchen door, and none of them noticed her cautious moves. Throughout the evening, she had been steadily raising the coal furnace's temperature to a point where it would have been unsafe to use even for cooking, but none of them realized it. The simplicity of her concept was exquisite, but the ramifications were horrifying. She had spent the last few days placing iron shackles and chains at key points around the house using her access to the estate's storage rooms. Normally meant to punish disobedient slaves, these restraint devices were now dispersed so she could swiftly secure anyone she came across. Based on her grandmother's knowledge, she had also made a particular concoction of indigenous plants that, if consumed through food or drink, could knock someone out in a matter of minutes. She had been serving brandy throughout the evening, and this concoction had been carefully put to the decanter. The initial consequences of Esperanza's planning were apparent as the members of the Rice Council continued to explore human breeding initiatives. Having drunk more brandy than the others, George Baxter started to feel lightheaded and confused. After a few minutes, he was sagging in his chair and fighting to stay conscious, which he blamed to the heat and booze. The other council members started to exhibit identical symptoms one by one. William Piton reported feeling suddenly nauseous. James Rutherford could no longer concentrate. Marcus Sutton's hands started to shake violently. The first to see that anything was terribly amiss was Edmund Grayfield. His voice was already a little slurred as he added, "Gentlemen, I think we might have been. Someone has." But before he could finish the sentence, his legs gave him and he fell to the expensive Persian carpet, which had cost him more than most colonists made in a year. The 14 members of the Rice Council were all unconscious in 20 minutes. Esperanza worked methodically, efficiently, securing each man's hands and feet with iron chains and rope. She employed the same shackles that had been used for years to bind thousands of slaves. They were meant to keep the victim alive and functional while causing pain and preventing escape. She was especially careful to make sure that each binding was snug enough to be extremely uncomfortable without completely stopping blood flow. She was not going to let these men escape at the expense of untimely death. She used broken English, Portuguese, and Spanish to communicate with each unconscious man while she worked. She alternated between describing what she was doing, narrating particular acts of cruelty she had seen, and just venting the anger that had been accumulating inside of her for the past 15 years. Whispering to James Rutherford, "You sell my Kwame like he is cow," she bound him with iron shackles at the ankles. She said to Marcus Sutton, "You break spirits. You teach people to stop being human. Tonight, I teach you what broken spirit feels like." Her voice carried 15 years of repressed hatred. "You buy and sell people like they are nothing. Tonight, you learn what it feels like to be nothing. You own me. You think you can do whatever you want to me. You think I am animal. Tonight, you see what animals do when they have no choice left." After securing the 14 men, Esperanza started the most time-consuming aspect of her strategy. She pulled the unconscious bodies from the dining room, through the house, and into the kitchen one by one. Because each guy weighed significantly more than she did, and because she had to move carefully to avoid creating noise that may awaken other slaves or overseers who might still be awake, this operation took about 3 hours. By 2 a.m., the 14 members of the Rice Council were positioned in a circle around the enormous coal furnace, with their mouths filled with raw cotton to keep them from calling for assistance when they regained consciousness, their feet pointing toward the center, and their hands bound behind their backs with iron shackles. Even for an unrestrained person, the heat emanating from the furnace, which had been stoked to its highest temperature, was almost intolerable in the kitchen. Esperanza anticipated that the combination of intense heat, dehydration, and limited mobility would result in a type of protracted torture that would allow these individuals to reflect on their fate while gradually passing away in excruciating pain. However, she had also included measures for a quicker kind of justice. The members of the Rice Council started to come to as the first gray light of dawn came in through the kitchen windows. When the torture started, the victims would be fully aware of their predicament, because the herb mixture she had employed was intended to render them comatose for a few hours without causing any lasting harm. The first to awaken was Edmund Grayfield, whose initial bewilderment soon gave way to fear upon realizing his situation. He lay on his own kitchen stone floor, hand and foot shackled in iron shackles, speechless due to the cotton in his mouth, and surrounded by his council members in similar condition. Heat radiated from the enormous coal furnace in the middle of their circle, which resembled a small version of hell. The sound of muffled shouts and frantic struggles against indestructible restraints filled the kitchen as the other men came to. For the first time in their lives, they were feeling the complete powerlessness they had caused to thousands of other people. Esperanza was quietly sitting in a kitchen nook, carefully honing the carving knives she used to prepare food. She had arranged herself so that each man could see her well, and she kept her gaze on each as they realized how dismal their circumstances were. She said, "Good morning, gentlemen," in a clear English that was much better than she had ever used in front of them. She got up and walked slowly around the circle, looking down at each man in his restraint with the same expression of cold evaluation they had used when examining slaves at the Charleston market. "I hope you rested well. We have much to discuss, and I want to make sure you are all paying attention." She stopped beside Marcus Sutton, who was frantically fighting against his restraints, and said, "I have served your meetings for 15 years. I have listened to your conversations. I have heard you discuss my people like we are cattle to be bought and sold and bred and slaughtered according to your convenience. You, Mr. Sutton, specialize in breaking spirits. You take people who still remember being human and teach them to forget. You have perfected techniques for destroying hope, for making proud men and women into hollow shells who exist only to serve your pleasure." She relocated to James Rutherford. "You, Rutherford, use family separation as a tool of control. You deliberately destroy the bonds between parents and children, between husbands and wives, because you have learned that people without families are easier to control." As she went around the circle, she called each man by name and related particular cruelties she had seen or heard about at their monthly gatherings. The men's hardships grew more dire and their muffled cries more desperate with every repetition. She went back to Edmund Grayfield at last. She walked back to the middle of the circle, standing right in front of the coal furnace. "And you, Mr. Grayfield, are the worst of all, because you could have chosen differently. You have wealth, power, and education. You could have treated us as human beings. Instead, you chose to be a monster, because being a monster was more profitable. Today, you are going to experience what it feels like to be powerless. You are going to learn what it means to be at the mercy of someone who views you as less than human. And you are going to die slowly, painfully, with plenty of time to think about all the suffering you have caused." Esperanza launched the last part of her plan with that announcement. In colonial South Carolina, what transpired over the course of the following 6 hours would become the subject of horror and legend. Esperanza de Lima turned the Grayfield estate kitchen into a theater of retribution, where 14 of the colony's most powerful men experienced for the first and last time what it was like to be totally defenseless in the hands of someone who thought of them as less than human. Even though the specifics would be buried in sealed government archives for more than 2 centuries, she started by torturing the men psychologically by slowly going around the circle and making them listen while she described in agonizing detail particular acts of cruelty she had seen during her 15 years of slavery. She told of proud men being systematically brutalized into broken shells, husbands being split from wives, and children being ripped from their mothers' arms. When these guys talked about the administration of their human property, they usually spoke in a cool, collected tone. Her eyes widened in horror as he recognized the incident. "Mr. Piton," she said, kneeling next to the frightened plantation owner. "Do you remember the woman named Asher? She was pregnant when you bought her in 1714. You worked her in the rice fields until the day she went into labor, then sold her baby to a trader from Georgia before she even recovered from childbirth. She cried for 3 days straight. You told your overseer to whip her for excessive noise that was disturbing your sleep. Similar to the majority of plantation owners, he had engaged in so many instances of careless brutality that they all merged into one memory. Esperanza, however, had recalled every specific, every name, every instance of systematic dehumanization she had seen. Charles Warwick is where she now resides. You enjoy watching punishments, Mr. Warwick. You attend whippings, like other men attend horse races. Last spring, you paid Mr. Warwick Grayfield $5 to let you personally administer 50 lashes to a man who had tried to run away. You took your time, spacing the strokes so he would remain conscious for the entire punishment. You smiled the whole time. The coal furnace's heat was getting intolerable. The shackled men's faces were dripping with sweat, which combined with horrified tears to leave dark stains on their pricey imported garments. A few of them had already started to exhibit symptoms of heat exhaustion, including flushed skin, fast breathing, and the glazed appearance that precedes collapse. Esperanza, however, had not yet completed the psychological aspect of her retaliation. From Edmund Grayfield's study, she took a leather-bound ledger, the same book in which he kept track of the acquisition, sale, and breeding of his human property. She opened it to a page at random and started reading entries out loud in the flat, impersonal voice of plantation owners discussing business dealings. April 12th, 1,715. Sold boy named Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford Plantation for breeding purposes, 45 pounds. Sterling. Note: mother became unmanageable after separation. Recommend immediate sale or disposal. She began to read. June 3rd, 1,715. Female named Rebecca, died in childbirth. Child survived. Estimated loss, 20 pounds. Sterling. Note: implement better nutrition program for breeding females to reduce mortality rates. She read page after page of clinical documentation of human suffering, mothers and fathers reduced to financial calculations in a businessman's ledger, families destroyed, and children sold. Every inscription symbolized a person's life, family, and hopes that were dashed by institutionalized exploitation. Esperanza made each man face the full extent of his crimes against humanity throughout the 2 hours of psychological torture. After paying close attention to their chats for 15 years, she developed an exceptional memory for details. She was able to remember names, dates, and exact cruelties that each man had ordered or committed. However, she proceeded to the next stage of her plan, when the morning light rose higher and the kitchen temperature dipped close to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. She took a few large iron rods from the kitchen storage room, which are usually used to move heavy cookware and stoke the coal stove. These rods were immediately heated to cherry-red temperatures that would produce painful burns when they came into contact with human flesh, after she positioned them straight into the furnace's flames. "Gentlemen," she said, "you have spent years perfecting techniques for causing pain without causing immediate death. You have learned how to torture people for maximum effect while keeping them alive and functional. Today I will demonstrate that your students have been paying attention." She removed the initial iron rod from the furnace. The metal radiated heat that was palpable from a distance of several feet, glowing like a fragment of trapped sunlight. She moved to Edmund Grayfield and brought the rod close enough to his face for him to feel the heat without touching it. Calmly, "This is for every slave you have branded like cattle," she continued. "This is for every human being you have marked as your property." What followed was too gruesome to go into detail about. However, slaves laboring in fields over a quarter of a mile away could hear the screams that reverberated through the Grayfield estate kitchen. They had never heard such a sound before. The frantic, anguished screams of men who had never known true helplessness and who were learning what their victims had gone through for decades. In order to maximize suffering in non-fatal regions while keeping her victims alive and conscious, Esperanza worked systematically, administering the heated iron to each man in turn. She had seen how they tortured their own people, and she knew just how much harm the human body could take and yet be capable of suffering. She carried on her psychological attack in between strokes of the hot iron, going into great detail about how each man's plantation would be passed down to family members who might or might not carry on their brutal methods. She discussed their offspring, openly speculating about whether the following generation would turn out to be as malevolent as their fathers, or if they may grow up to be somewhat compassionate. She murmured, "Your son, William," to Marcus Sutton, who was writhing in pain. "He is only 16 years old. Maybe there is still time for him to become a better man than his father. Maybe when he learns what happened to you, he will decide that treating people as property is too dangerous. Just as terrible as the physical torment was the psychological toll. The idea that these men were superior humans, born masters, with the right to dominate and take advantage of other people, had formed the foundation of their entire identity. Esperanza was methodically erasing that identity, making them feel like victims and things that could be controlled by others. Several of the men started to exhibit symptoms of acute heat stroke when the afternoon heat and the radiation from the furnace caused the kitchen temperature to rise above 130 degrees. Their skin became dry and red. Their attempts to resist the shackles grew less and more desperate, and their breathing became shallow and fast. Esperanza, however, had prepared for this possibility. She was not going to let them get away via heat-induced stupor or unconsciousness. She kept them alert and cognizant while their bodies cooked slowly in the superheated air by applying damp cloths to their foreheads and forcing little amounts of water into their mouths, using methods she had learned from her grandmother. "You have to remain awake," she instructed them. "You must remain alert. Death is a mercy, and you have not earned mercy yet." Esperanza kept the furnace at its highest temperature and methodically applied heated iron rods to each man's body while the torture went on during the warmest part of the afternoon. She targeted the cheeks, hands, and feet, areas that would be painfully visible and serve as enduring reminders of their ordeal. The total reversal of power dynamics that the experience symbolized, rather than the physical anguish, was arguably its most terrible feature. These 14 men were for the first time in their life feeling what their slaves went through on a daily basis. The awareness that another human being controlled their bodies, their comfort, and their survival itself. They were being taught the meaning of property. Esperanza was getting ready for the last part of her meticulously planned retaliation as nightfall drew near and shadows started to fall across the kitchen floor. For almost 18 hours, the coal furnace had been operating at maximum temperature, producing a temperature that was literally intolerable for prolonged human exposure. In order to keep the guys alive long enough to completely comprehend their fate, she started bringing the semi-conscious men closer to the furnace, where the extreme heat would gradually cook their bodies. She had seen Marcus Sutton explain it at one of the meetings of the Rice Council. It was a measure he employed to punish slaves who tried to flee. "This is how you killed Thomas," she said to Sutton, placing his body 3 feet from the coals that were blazing. "Remember Thomas, the young man who tried to run away last summer? You put him in a metal cage in direct sunlight and let him cook slowly over 3 days. He begged for water. He begged for shade. He begged for death. You ignored all his pleas because you wanted other slaves to witness his suffering." She placed each of the 14 men in a position where the radiant heat of the furnace would slowly kill them, but leave them awake long enough to think about their misdeeds. For her, the psychological effect was just as significant as the actual damage. She wanted them to know as clearly as possible that they were dying as a result of the decisions, deeds, and lives they had destroyed. On the evening of the 24th of June, 1716, 14 dying men were in the kitchen of Grayfield Estate, feeling for the first and last time what it was like to be totally helpless in the hands of someone who thought they were less than human. A few hours before, the yelling had ceased, to be replaced by the softer voices of males whose vocal cords had been weakened by protracted sobbing. Beside the same furnace they had used to cook the meals they had enslaved, 14 of colonial South Carolina's most prominent inhabitants were slowly roasted to death, filling the kitchen with the smell of burning flesh and the sound of laborious breathing. Humming the Portuguese lullaby her mother had sang to her in the village, that Portuguese raiders had devastated 20 years prior, Esperanza sat in her corner, still carefully sharpening kitchen knives. Although her gaze had shifted away from the dying men, her ears continued to monitor their breaths to make sure none of them passed out before receiving the full extent of the justice she had intended. The heat, thirst, and burns that had been gradually killing the members of the Rice Council throughout the day eventually claimed their lives as midnight drew near. The last surviving person was Edmund Grayfield, whose constitution had been fortified by years of luxurious living and access to health care that his slaves had never had. His final comprehensible words were a pitiful attempt at negotiating, uttered in a whisper that could hardly be heard above the sound of coal burning. Esperanza gave him the same look of mild interest he had used when examining slaves at the Charleston market, and he said, "Please, I can give you money, freedom, whatever you want." Calmly, "I want you to die knowing that you were wrong," she said. Edmund Grayfield's final words before the heat and dehydration ultimately took his life were, "You are not superior. You are not chosen by God. You are not a natural master. You are just a man who chose to be evil, and now you are paying the price for that choice." A scene that would torment the survivors for the rest of their lives was revealed when dawn broke on the 25th of June 1716. In the Grayfield estate kitchen, 14 burnt corpses were found in a perfect circle around the enormous coal fire as the other plantation slaves started their morning chores. After being exposed to intense heat for 18 hours, the bodies were reduced to blackened shells and hardly recognized as human. Esperanza de Lima was discovered singing a melancholic tune that none of the other slaves could identify, as she sat quietly at the kitchen table, painstakingly honing carving knives. Despite having planned and watched one of the most complex acts of retaliation in colonial American history, she displayed no signs of distress or fatigue. Upon arriving to investigate, the white overseers from the plantation discovered a scene that contradicted their conception of the natural order. One slave woman had miraculously overcome all 14 of the colony's most powerful men and tortured them in a way that was beyond anything they had ever experienced. The ramifications were horrifying. What would happen if slaves started planning more complex forms of resistance if one slave could do this much destruction against several plantation owners? The immediate and significant psychological effects were felt by the white colonial populace. They started to fear the individuals they had enslaved for the first time. Within days, riders who had been sent to alert the victims' relatives and business acquaintances of the killing disseminated the news across the colony. However, determining how to react to the occurrence presented a significant challenge for the colonial authorities. On the one hand, they had to show that slave revolt would be promptly and violently put down. The slaves' conviction that resistance was pointless and that white supremacy was unquestionable and unassailable was essential to the plantation system as a whole. However, they had to stop the dissemination of specific details regarding Esperanza's strategies and achievements. The entire colonial economy might collapse if other slaves discovered that a single woman with only brains, perseverance, and resolve could kill 14 plantation owners. To address the problem, Governor Robert Johnson called an emergency meeting of the Colonial Council. Following 3 days of intense discussion, they came to a conclusion that put political stability ahead of public fairness. By gubernatorial decree, the official documents of the Grayfield Massacre were sealed and placed in the Charleston archives, with a 50-year prohibition on their opening. During a business meeting, the victims' families were notified that their loved ones had perished in a horrific fire that had destroyed the Grayfield estate kitchen. Esperanza's part in their demise was not mentioned. Esperanza's own issue was more complicated. If she were to be executed in public, her crimes would have to be explained, which would disseminate the very information the colonial authorities wished to keep quiet. However, letting her survive would convey the idea that a slave uprising could be successful without facing any repercussions. They came up with a solution that was both politically convenient and brutal. Esperanza received a penalty that was widely regarded as a postponed death sentence. She was to be sold to a Spanish trader who specialized in providing slaves to the South American silver mines. Slaves in the Spanish mines usually lived for fewer than 2 years before passing out from weariness, illness, or accidents due to the harsh working conditions. However, there were dangers in even this sentence. Esperanza might become a symbol of victorious resistance that could spur more uprisings if she lived long enough to tell her story to other enslaved people. This issue was resolved by the colonial authorities, who made sure Esperanza would never make it to the Spanish mines alive. Esperanza de Lima was carried onto a Spanish commercial ship named the Santa Isabella that was headed for Cartagena on the 15th of July, 1716, precisely 3 weeks after the Grayfield Massacre. In order to make her death seem accidental, the ship's captain had been discreetly ordered to make sure she did not survive the journey. On the evening tide, the Santa Isabella left Charleston Harbor with Esperanza and 43 additional slaves. She passed away from a fever on the third day of the journey, according to the ship's official record, and was buried at sea in accordance with accepted nautical customs. However, there were murmurs. According to some of the Grayfield estate's surviving slaves, Esperanza had mentioned backup plans and allies in the Spanish lands who would aid her in escaping if she survived the sea voyage. Others speculated that she may have made arrangements for help during the journey after being spotted conversing with free black sailors in Charleston Harbor. Most importantly, a number of slaves stated that Esperanza had taught other domestic staff about anatomy, herbs, the flaws of their owners, and the vulnerabilities of the plantation system during her last weeks at the estate. "Justice burns slower than coal," she had stated to them, "but burns complete. The fire I started will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, other masters who think they are safe." It was impossible to know if there was any truth to these rumors. In order to prevent any coordination of their stories or activities, the colonial authorities promptly sold the other slaves from Grayfield Estate to plantations across the region. However, the psychological harm had already been done. Unrest rippled through South Carolina's slave villages in the months after the Grayfield Massacre. Esperanza's systematic execution of the Rice Council members was the only mass murder that occurred, but plantation owners started to report an unprecedented number of minor occurrences that signaled concerted opposition. Several plantation homes were suspiciously destroyed by kitchen fires. After eating potentially poisoned feed, valuable livestock inexplicably died. During their most vulnerable moments, white overseers experienced strange mishaps. Weapons and tools that had vanished from storage facilities were discovered days later in areas that might have been occupied by slaves. Slaves started exhibiting knowledge of their owners' private routines, commercial dealings, and familial ties that well exceeded what their jobs should have allowed, which was particularly upsetting to the colonial authorities. With information easily flowing between properties that had previously been segregated from one another, it appeared as though an intelligence network had grown throughout the plantation system. For the white colonial population, the psychological effects were severe and long-lasting. Previously moving across their properties with easy confidence, plantation owners suddenly avoided routines and traveled with armed escorts. Because no one wanted to congregate in big numbers that may make them easy targets for retaliation, the monthly meetings that had been a vital part of the Rice Council's coordination were put on indefinite hold. Some plantation owners changed how they treated slaves out of practical fear rather than a moral enlightenment. Maintaining the loyalty of slaves through marginally improved treatment may be a prudent investment in personal protection if they were capable of the kind of complex planning and execution that Esperanza had displayed. However, other masters took a different approach, enforcing even more severe regulations and penalties in an effort to scare their slaves into obedience. Higher rates of escape attempts, work stoppages, and unexplained mishaps indicated that these planters' tactics were failing. In response, the colonial administration enacted new legislation that limited slave mobility, forbade get-togethers of more than 3 slaves without white supervision, and stipulated severe punishments for any slave found in possession of weapons or potentially lethal instruments. However, these regulations were hard to implement throughout the dispersed plantation system, and by forcing slave organization underground, they might have even sparked more complex forms of resistance. Most importantly, Esperanza de Lima's story spread among the sympathetic white abolitionists who were starting to create anti-slavery groups, free black settlements, and underground railroad stations. Her name became into a symbol of defiance that sparked more uprisings across the American colonies. Later, historians would argue over whether the Grayfield Massacre was the start of a more organized type of slave resistance that ultimately led to the plantation system's downfall, or if it was a singular act of personal retaliation. Although conclusive analysis was impossible due to the sealed colonial archives, the circumstantial evidence indicated that Esperanza's acts had sparked similar instances across the South. The Stono Rebellion, the biggest slave revolt in colonial American history, broke out in South Carolina in 1739, 23 years after the Grayfield Massacre. Slaves who had labored on plantations linked to the original Rice Council network were some of the leaders of the uprising, albeit the precise links to Esperanza's acts could not be established. Although the uprising was ultimately put down, It showed that the psychological effects of the Grayfield Massacre had not diminished over time. Slaves in the area had discovered that their masters were not unbeatable, that strategic planning could defeat superior numbers and weaponry, and that resistance efforts might be successful despite overwhelming odds. Esperanza de Lima's story was included into the oral tradition that helped slave communities get through their worst moments as the years went by, and the American Revolution changed the political climate of the colonies. The woman who had forced 14 lords to pay for their misdeeds was a story that parents told their kids. Young slaves discovered that they could resist, that patience and intelligence could be more potent than brute force, and that justice might take longer than expected but would come. Governor Johnson ordered that the sealed documents in Charleston's archives not be unsealed for precisely 50 years. In 1766, the American colonies were experiencing political turmoil that ultimately resulted in their independence from Britain when they were eventually made available to scholars. Although the Grayfield Massacre was overlooked by more significant historical occurrences, it helped people realize that slavery was a system that was doomed to fail. The plantation system that had appeared so stable and unbeatable in 1716 was already exhibiting symptoms of internal strain that would ultimately cause the country to fall apart by the time the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788. The relationship between master and slave had been radically altered by the psychological effects of realizing that slaves were capable of planning, organizing, and carrying out complex acts of resistance. The masters had lost faith in their supreme authority. The slaves had lost faith in their complete helplessness. And the end of slavery in America began with that change in psychological equilibrium. Rumors of the truth started to surface in the years after the Grayfield slaughter, coming from the most unlikely places. During a supply break at Havana in late 1716, a Spanish ship's clerk wrote in his private notebook about an amazing encounter with a Portuguese-speaking woman who had been surreptitiously moved from the Santa Isabella. The talk took place during a voyage to Cartagena. The clerk reported that this woman was quite intelligent while discussing the South Carolina plantation system, outlining in great detail the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of each individual plantation owner across the colony. While claiming to have planned the first lesson, she hinted that it would not be the last. The fire that began in one kitchen, she allegedly warned the worker, will spread to many kitchens. The lessons I learned from watching masters at their evil work are now being taught to new students. Although it would never be possible to verify whether this woman was actually Esperanza de Lima, colonial records from Spanish Florida started to chronicle the arrival of fugitive slaves who were remarkably knowledgeable about plantation operations across the British colonies. The intelligence network that these refugees appeared to have access to was far more extensive than any one escapee should have been aware of. Reports about communities of former slaves actively aiding resistance efforts and escape attempts in the British colonies started to come in from Spanish areas, which alarmed the colonial authorities even more. Detailed directions for locating sympathetic contacts, avoiding patrol routes, and taking advantage of the psychological weaknesses of plantation owners who had become reckless in their confidence were included in letters intercepted by colonial officials. The colonial government was compelled to admit that slave resistance had progressed from sporadic escape attempts to something akin to organized warfare by 1724, years after the Grayfield Massacre. Owners of plantations all over South Carolina started to describe coordinated events that seemed to indicate methodical preparation and intelligence collection. Several plantation homes were destroyed by kitchen fires for reasons that could not be explained by natural causes. After eating feed that seemed to have been purposefully contaminated, valuable livestock inexplicably perished. White overseers experienced deadly mishaps when they were most alone and exposed. The most disturbing of all was that slaves started to show far more awareness of their masters' commercial dealings, personal habits, and family secrets than their given responsibilities should have indicated. Information was readily flowing across properties that had previously been isolated from one another, as if an invisible network had grown throughout the whole system. The psychological change was significant and long-lasting. Plantation owners who had previously traversed their estates with a lack of formality now avoided rituals and traveled with armed escorts. Since no one wanted to be an appealing target for planned retaliation, The monthly meetings that had been essential to the coordination of the Rice Council were permanently halted. Some slave owners changed the way they treated their slaves, out of practical fear rather than moral awakening. Maintaining loyalty through marginally improved conditions might be a prudent investment in one's own survival if their human property was capable of the complex planning and execution that had destroyed the Rice Council. However, other plantation owners reacted more violently, enforcing stricter regulations and more severe penalties in an effort to scare their slaves into complete obedience. Work slowdowns, escape attempts, and unexplained mishaps were more common on these estates, indicating that their tactics were backfiring. New rules that restricted slave movement, forbade gatherings, and stipulated harsh punishments for any slave discovered in possession of possible weapons were enforced by the colonial administration. However, these rules were hard to implement throughout the dispersed plantation system, and they might have even sparked more advanced underground organization. Esperanza de Lima's story became interwoven with the narrative of slave resistance in the American colonies as the decades went by. About the woman who had forced 14 masters to pay for their brutality, parents whispered to their kids. Young slaves discovered that justice might be delayed but would come in due time, that their owners were not unassailable, and that strategic planning might defeat superior numbers and weaponry. As directed by Governor Johnson, the sealed documents in Charleston's archives were kept hidden, but the truth had already leaked out in other ways. Every slave community was aware of the fundamental facts. 14 of the colony's most powerful men had been slaughtered by a single woman who had survived to evade justice because she had only been armed with brains and willpower. The psychological impact of Esperanza's story became more significant than whether she had lived to carry on her work in Spanish Florida or whether the stories of her subsequent actions were made up to give hope to those in need. The masters had lost faith in their supreme authority. The slaves had lost faith in their complete helplessness. The seeds of all that would come next, including the burgeoning resistance movements, the networks of the Underground Railroad, and the tenacious uprisings that would ultimately lead to the demise of the entire plantation system, were planted in that basic shift in psychological equilibrium. After that night of reckoning, Grayfield Estate's kitchen remained unoccupied for 66 years before slowly collapsing under the weight of successive owners who could not staff the space. In the room where Esperanza had illustrated what happened to masters who strained their human property beyond endurance, the local slaves refused to work. The entire building was eventually destroyed, and the area was permitted to revert to nature. However, the lesson persisted, having been taught by generations of enslaved families who saw that treating other people like property is dangerous. Property is capable of thought. Property is able to plan. Property is able to recall everything. And occasionally, property retaliates when it is pushed past the bounds of human endurance. Although it burns more slowly than coal, justice burns completely. How do you feel about this tale? Are secrets still hidden in the archives of our country's troubled past, or do you think all was made public? Share your opinions about this incredible story of retaliation and resistance by leaving a comment below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with someone who values the power of untold stories. If you liked this exploration of America's secret past and would like to see more tales that expose the reality behind official narratives, although the winners write history, victims' voices occasionally get to be heard across the ages. We'll continue examining the sinister truths that shaped our country in the upcoming video. See you then.